My guest today is Randall B. Smith. He's a professor of theology at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas. He also teaches regularly in the university's interdisciplinary honors program. We're going to be discussing his new book, From Here to Eternity, Reflections on Death, Immortality, and the Resurrection of the Body. Welcome to the show, Randall.
Thanks very much.
It's great to have you here.
No, it's great to be here, and thank you for having me to talk about the book.
You're welcome. The book has such an interesting title. It caught my eye when I first saw the title. I'm like, okay, that's an interesting title. What brought you to write about death and the afterlife?
As I say in the preface of the book, when you're writing a book about death, people say, "Is everything okay?" Are you working through some things? And the answer is no. I wasn't really working through some things. Actually, granted, I did start the book when we were in the midst of COVID. And so I thought, this might be a seller, this might actually get people might be more interested in this topic than they would have been otherwise. But the truth is that the thoughts about this that are in the heart of this book go back many years, actually, and primarily started with reflections on the resurrection of the body and the meaning of the resurrection of the body. I decided at a certain point that I would set that off against other discussions about the afterlife to kind of play up or to show the meaningfulness, right, and how different that is and how important it is to understand the resurrection of the body, as opposed to these sort of other views of the afterlife, which I don't think really satisfy people in the ways that people oftentimes think they would. So actually, it really started out as a book on the resurrection of the body and reflections on the resurrection of the body. And again, then at a certain point, I thought, we could talk about generally, how we face death and the question of the afterlife. It's one of the questions that Pope John Paul II lists at the beginning of Fides et Ratio as the fundamental questions that we have to face. Who am I? Where am I from? Where am I going? And one of them is, what about death? Is there anything after death? What about the afterlife? And so I thought, well, this is worth asking. This is a fundamental question the Pope talks about. We should talk about it.
Mm-hmm. There's different views on the afterlife. There's the Christian view of afterlife, and there's the non-Christian view of afterlife. And then even amongst Christians, there's different views on the afterlife. What is the view of afterlife for the Catholics?
Well, I think not only for Catholics, but for all Christians in a way, or something I point to, is, which should be in a way, right? I mean, there are images about heaven in the scriptures and, of course, in art, all of which are fine and do important things, right? City on a hill, the New Jerusalem. And then, of course, in artistic renderings, you sometimes get lots of people on clouds and such, and trumpets and little angels and stuff. It's all very sweet. And so I have no problem with that. But my argument is that what we know about the afterlife, what we know about heaven, is revealed to us most fully and most clearly in the person of the resurrected Christ. That Christ is the first fruits of what we too will enjoy. And so it's very important to understand what Christianity is promising, as St. Paul understands, in terms of the resurrection. For St. Paul, the good news is the news of Christ's death and resurrection as being, the source of our victory over death. So that's where I begin. I mean, that to me is where we have to focus our attention primarily. And all the other imagery is great, but does a secondary kind of role.
What are some of the popular beliefs of non-Christians on the afterlife?
Well, logically, one way is simply to say, and I sort of try to go through this and then give sort of examples. One way is to say, well, there's nothing after this life, right? The Epicureans famously sort of held this, that the only reason that anybody feared death was because they feared the afterlife, that there'd be some horrible punishments or horrible. And they said, well, no, there's nothing. You cease to exist. So there's no pain, there's no pleasure, there's no anything. And they said, so, why would you be frightened of that? Well, It strikes me that's not exactly a comforting message for most people, right? The idea of oblivion and becoming nothing. Um,
Mhm.
Granted, there wouldn't be any pain necessarily, but there wouldn't necessarily be uh, anything, right? I mean, you just cease to exist, and the ceasing of one's existence is not a pleasant thought. Another possibility is to think of there is an afterlife. This was true in the ancient Greek world, a lot of the ancient world, actually. We think of heaven as this blessed place. If you read Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus makes a journey to the underworld. It's not a pleasant place. People are shades there. They don't have bodies. It's sad. Even the great hero Achilles, Odysseus says to him, "But Achilles, you're one of the most famous people. You have all this glory." And he says, "I'd rather be the slave of a poor farmer than dead." So this is a very interesting vision of the afterlife, which, to my mind, actually kind of undermines in important and interesting ways the ideal that you saw in the Iliad of the great hero. You
Mhm.
do all these things, you gain all this glory, you're one of the great heroes, but then in the end, you just go to the lower realms and hang around with the shades, miserable like everybody else. It's an odd kind of view. Another view you could have of the afterlife, you see in Virgil's Aeneid, for example, with there Aeneas. Virgil has Aeneas go into the underworld, and there's rewards and punishments. So there is a realm where people who've done bad things get punished, and then there's the Elysian fields, which also you see in Dante's
Mhm.
picture of the afterlife in the beginning of the Inferno. And the Elysian fields are for those who have been good and lovely, and so they exist in these fields. But it's very interesting. Two things about that. One is it seems to some people a little boring, perhaps. All right. But also not exactly noble and worthy, right? I mean, what Roman would really want to go off and just be sitting, on some couch in some field, enjoying themselves while Rome was endangered, which is why, actually, as people sometimes don't notice, at the end of that story, Virgil and his father, I'm sorry, not Virgil, but Aeneas and his father go to this river, which is the river Lethe, and they see a whole group of people there. And Aeneas says to his father, "What? Who are these people?" And he goes, "Oh, well, they're going to go be reincarnated." So reincarnation actually is another possibility. But of
Right.
course, one of the characteristics of reincarnation, no matter where it is, well, in the Roman, is you have to cross the river Lethe, which is the river of forgetfulness. Why that? Well, because you have to wipe the slate clean, right? You have to start over so that everything you've experienced, everything you've done, everything you've learned has to be wiped clean. So you start because, of course, we don't start our lives with all the memories and all the wisdom that we may have gained in some previous life. So that, it seems to me, is problematic. I don't argue against I do think that's a problem for certain Eastern religions who believe in reincarnation. But then I don't really take that up. That's a serious idea, right? Unlike people who just believe in past lives, I'm sorry, in now in the West, in the East, this is a serious moral idea, right? I mean, in other words, you live a life, and then if you're worthy, the things you do will affect future lives, right? So that you are meant to sort of rise up on the levels of incarnation or reincarnation. So eventually you escape the cycles of reincarnation. Well, that's a decidedly moral view, right? I'm not so sure how many people in the West would be willing to accept the idea that they're suffering certain punishments now because of something they did in a past life. They don't remember who was that guy. I supposedly did what to who, in 1500 or something, and now I'm suffering, and I'm supposed to sacrifice myself now for some life that might exist in 200. Look, it has its problems, but one might at least say about the East that it's a serious moral idea, right? You're supposed to live morally and decently and nobly so that you can rise up. People who are just playing around with reincarnation, it seems to me, are just sort of saying, well, this is my pretend life or something like that, which is, I don't think, a healthy way of thinking about it. Um, And then, of course, there's just notions of an afterlife, which I think a lot of people, unfortunately, have, and even Christians, which is an escape from this world, right? You live this life, and then God takes the good people away. This is kind of like the Left Behind series, I mean, so the good people get taken away, and then we're left to kind of fight this thing out or something. And I don't know. It just seems to me like an odd system whereby God takes all the good people away. And now, thanks God, right? I mean, so, we had this sort of smattering of good people around that were kind of helping us out. And now God's going, well, I'm going to take them out. And anyway, but then they get to go to some other nice place, and we're stuck here in the bad place. Anyway, the basic theme of the book is that it has tended to seem for people over the centuries, and I think this is true, that you need some notion of an afterlife to make this life not meaningless. If everything we've done, everything we've learned, all our friends, people we've loved, in the end come to nothing, this seems to make life meaningless. On the other hand, you can have a notion of the afterlife that makes this life meaningless, right? If heaven is so good, or if it's a certain kind of character, why not just get there, right? I mean, like, why does God stick us in this horrible place if in the end we're meant to be in heaven? So it seems to me you need a notion of the afterlife that doesn't render this life, right, and this creation and this realm meaningless. Because again, if you're a Gnostic and you believe that the world is completely fallen away from the one or the soul or the spirit, well, then you can say to yourself, well, yeah, we just need to escape, right? But if you're a Christian and you believe that everything God has made is good, very good, right? That though the world is fallen, God redeems the world, then you have to have a view of the afterlife that isn't merely an escape, that isn't merely an abandonment of the people you love and the world that we love rightly, when we love it rightly. You need a notion of the afterlife that affirms this life. And I argue that in some ways, the only adequate notion of the afterlife is precisely the notion of the resurrection of the body and the communion of saints.
You mentioned something earlier about, if you think it's final and there's nothing afterwards, it's a pretty painful thing to live with, to know when you die, it's over. And that could be one of the reasons that so many people are into life extension and trying to live as long as they possibly can, because they don't have a view of the afterlife.
Yeah. If although there's two tendencies, as we can see in contemporary society, right? One is to either extend life forever, never, never, which has its drawbacks because you can't, right? Again, in the ancient world, there's a lot of discussion about this. They think a lot about death and about immortality. And there are plenty of, we might say, stories, parables, et cetera, about this attempt to live forever. It never ends well. They understand that this is a bad idea. All right. There's a famous character that shows up, for example, actually in T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland at the beginning. But this famous character is the Sibyl of Cumae, who's the prophetess at Cumae, where actually Aeneas goes to get into the underworld. But anyway, the notion is the Sibyl, as a prophetess, asks the gods for eternal life, which she is granted, but she forgets to ask for eternal youth. And as a result, she goes on and on and on, and gets older and older and older, till she's so shrunken that she hangs in a jar or something from the roof of the cave. At the beginning of The Wasteland, it says, in Latin from Petronius, the Satyricon, it says, Sibyl, Sibyl, the little boy, the young boys would tease her and say, Sibyl, Sibyl, what do you want? And she said, I want to die, right? Anyway, there's many stories this way of people. Gulliver's Travels has another one of people who live on and on and on. And the problems with that, they forget everything. They just get older and older. Anyway, so that idea is problem. Of course, the other thing we have in society, other than just extend life on and on and on, is people who commit suicide more, right? Like, oh yeah, I'm just going to take myself out. The idea of a natural death, right, as that's something which is just part of the nature of life, is something we've forgotten because we don't deal with it. We've taken death and we've sort of sterilized it. We've put it away from ourselves in a room somewhere, a hospital room oftentimes, right? Where it's like, okay, why don't you go over there all by yourself and die? And I think this is very, very tragic and very unhealthy. That part of, asking the fundamental questions, as John Paul II says, right? Thinking about life involves encountering and facing up to the question of death, because death simply is, I know this is kind of a strange thing to say, but death is a part of life. And so we really have to face that, right? As a society and as individuals. And I don't think we have. So that's why I argue, actually, in the book at the beginning, will this book help? And the answer is, well, in one sense, I hope it helps people. And in another sense, no. Right? It's just not sufficient, right? What I argue we need is a community, but not only a community. What we really need is the church, right? And we need liturgy. And all of this business about death, which has been sterilized and medicalized and, put into the funeral home business. And there's nothing less like a home than a funeral home, right? Should all be brought back into the church, right? The wake, the viewing of the body, and actually, I argue very much for the return to churchyards. Cemeteries around churches, so people can have this sense that they are surrounded constantly by the communion of saints and by those they loved, right, who are in the process of being more fully incorporated into the risen body of Christ.
You don't see those churchyards very frequently in the United States anymore, except in the smaller communities.
Yeah. In older things. Actually, I knew a guy who went to the person who was responsible for cemeteries and different things in the chancery office somewhere, to which and he said, hey, I've read this and this is interesting. We should have churchyards in the this guy said, I don't know whether this is true about what the bishop thought, but it might be. But anyway, this is very depressing. This guy said, no. The bishop doesn't want any churchyards because if you have a churchyard, it makes it impossible to close the parish. At that point, I thought to myself, oh boy, if parishes knew this, right, they'd immediately bury 10 people in their backyard, like, oh my goodness, this is why they don't want to have a churchyard, because, then they won't be able to close us down. And I always argue, yeah, this is the way you set down roots. This is the way you tell people, no, we're here to stay. Okay. Right. This is where my ancestors are. This is where I've grown up. We're here to last, 2000 years from now, all the rest of this stuff will be gone, but we'll still be here. Mm-hmm. That's an important thing, it seems to me, to say visually. And again, like the visual embodiment of this belief in the resurrection of the body. It's not a good thing that it's acceptable in the church. It's just not the best thing to burn bodies, right? Etc. And to sort of get rid of them in this way, because it shows that, people really think, oh, what I do after death is that I just discard my body and go off as a spirit and live in the spirit realm. Well, that's a Gnostic idea, right? Mm-hmm. It's not the Christian idea. The Christian idea is the resurrection of the body. And again, as you no longer have churchyards, people forget the past and they forget their duties to their ancestors and to their descendants, to the people in the future. You don't have that visual representation of that connection anymore, of the communion of saints. To people to whom I owe a tremendous debt of gratitude from the past, and thus need to pay forward to future generations that will come 200 years, 300 years in the future.
Mm-hmm. You talk about the communion of saints. What is the communion of saints?
Well, strictly speaking, it's just that the saints, who are united to the triune God, the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, connected to the body of Christ, right? But clearly, there are people that we say as a church officially enjoy the beatific vision, and we call them saints. That's a term, of course, that goes back to the New Testament, where people are given that term. But now we have, where technically there are Saint Francis, Saint Dominic, Saint Thomas Aquinas. This is all very, very good. I love the as we sometimes call it, the cult of the saints, okay, which when I was a Protestant and became a Catholic concerned me. Now, of course, I relish in it in a great deal. These are important figures, and I believe they pray for me, and I pray, I ask them for their prayers all the time. But look, the church has always accepted the notion that there are others who enjoy the beatific vision other than just the ones who are publicly recognized as saints. People are publicly recognized as saints for various and sundry reasons. I mean, they had a public witness in various and sundry ways. We see the grace in their lives shined, and their lives are after death are accompanied by miracles. Anyway, there's a number of ways in which people are recognized as saints. But the point is, the communion of saints would be all those who enjoy the beatific vision. Right. However, and so I am to a certain extent including those who might be, still in purgatory in various and sundry ways. It seems to me they're also united to us in that cleansing that comes through Jesus Christ. But in any case, still, all of those who enjoy the beatific vision, all of those who are united in Christ, right, in this eternal communion of love between the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, which has been going on from all eternity. That's what we consider to be the communion of saints.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned earlier suicide. It's a very painful thing, especially when the person is young that does it, and it's a painful thing no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
What are some things that you can do to accompany somebody that it's experienced that, a family member?
Oh, like somebody who's committed suicide, like they've had a member of their family that's committed suicide. Yeah. No, this is a very difficult question, right? And I think communities struggle with it. I don't really take it up in the book, but I mean, this is the very important pastoral question. It strikes me, having experienced in my life different people who committed suicide, that it leaves a huge hole. It leaves a hole that regular natural death doesn't tend to leave, right? I mean, all death leaves us a hole in certain ways, but suicide particularly has. So my advice, going along with all the rest of it, is that one of the problems, it seems to me, is precisely the issue of loneliness, right? A culture that sort of lauds individual autonomy and self-sufficiency, that doesn't really then understand our communal, social, relational dimensions, right? So what you would do, it seems to me, to help prevent suicide, right, in the first place, is to try to make sure that people are brought into a community, right, and feel that communal love, which we believe exists in the afterlife now. Mm-hmm. Part of the theme of the book is that, right, you begin living a heavenly life here, right? You start participating in that threefold communion of love between the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit now in this life. And the promise is that you never can have to be parted from it, right? But it's not like you live a kind of hellish life here and then eventually you get it all back somehow. And that seems to me to be a very wrong way of thinking about it. Again, you don't want to sort of suggest that heaven involves a meaningless life, or the kind of life we would consider to be completely ignoble. And precisely what the notion, I mean, the famous one is, so if you live a chaste life here and you do all sorts of good things, well, then you get sex with 76 virgins in heaven or something. Well, that would be absurd in a way, right? So you would be doing something in the afterlife which you would consider to be completely sinful and horrible in this life. It doesn't make any sense, right?
Right.
Namely, I just think, so anyway, if we understand this heaven as this communion of persons, this selfless love for each other, it seems to me that's what we need to inculcate in people. And it seems to me that precisely what we need to make clear to people, right, in this circumstance is the degree to which when people have committed suicide, right, they're connected to others. They think, well, I'm just taking myself out, right? But what they have done is torn a horrible hole in, a whole fabric of relationships. And so what they've done is been disastrous for others. And so when communities are struggling with this, they neither want to sort of say, oh, this person has gone to hell or something, right? On the other hand, it seems to me sometimes we don't want to be too I don't want to say sympathetic, right? But we don't want to make it seem as though this was just okay, right? We don't want to laud this somehow or something, right? Because again, this is a person who has, I think we should take it as a great failure on our part, right? That somehow this person didn't feel the love of a community that we really need. And so you want to make clear to the family that this is or to the friends and the people around, that we have to live life differently, right? If we're struck by the tragedy of a suicide, then we have to take this as an occasion not to feel more and more depressed and more distant from others, but to bring them closer to us, right? Both for our own well-being and for their well-being. This seems to me what we really have to do, right? We have to reinvest ourselves in that community and that series of relationships so that people know that they are loved and people know that their lives matter to other people and that they're connected. And again, so when they do these things to themselves, they're harming everybody around them who loves them.
Mm-hmm. As we look to natural death, what can we learn from death?
I hope, I think that we can learn to value life, right? I say in the book, I think there's an old kind of sense of this, that in the ancient world, that those people who ignore death don't know really how to value life, right? And again, there are stories in the ancient world. And actually, there's a modern story. There's an opera called The Macropolis Case, Elena Macropolis, and she's a woman who lives on and on and on forever. And she has been through so many different experiences and seen so many different people that she loved die, but she doesn't die, that she yearns for death, right? Because her life has come to seem meaningless. So I do think we need to understand death in a certain way. We need to face up to death in a certain way, as simply as this, right? As I argue in the book, right? I mean, about, the sort of immortality project that we get in a lot of the modern world, to recognize, not only would this be bad for me, right? Namely, all these stories suggest the foolishness of trying to live on and on and on and on and on forever. But even if you don't believe that, it's clear, right, that old growth has to sort of be cleared out so that new growth can come, right? I mean, in other words, if everyone lived forever, okay, then you could have no new people. All right, pretty soon the 8 billion people in the world would be 50 billion people in the world would be, right? So what you're saying is, okay, so yeah, here's what we'd have to do if we lived forever. We'd have to make sure that no one ever had any sex. Well, how is that for a life? Okay, A, and B, right, nobody can reproduce. But it's not only the sex, it's nobody, again, there's no new growth. There's no, again, people have to go through these stages. And if they realize that, they realize, yeah, I have to become a grandparent so that my children can become parents. And then we need to move on. Right? That's the nature of the generation of the planet and of the health of society, is that this natural course take place. Then we don't yearn in the same way, right, for our individual immortality in this life. We realize, yeah, this is people don't die because they're like bad people or something like that. Yes, we have death and we experience death in the way we do because of the fall. But now people don't die because they're bad. People die because that's the natural course of life. right? Again, I try when, people somebody said, oh, my grandfather died, and I'll say, how old was your grandfather? And oh, 89, and you go like, lived a full, life with children and grandchildren, et cetera, et cetera. Um, you know, it's not like, well, he touched an electrical circuit and he died, or, like, even at 89, you might go, well, it was a mistake, but um, so, it is a natural part of life, and something that we have to face up to, because of course that tells us, I hope, every day. In the end of the book, I talk about the second coming. I think it's a similar idea, right? Like, well, when is the second coming? And the answer is, well, look, it could be before the end of this conversation. Okay. I say this to my students in class. Say, look, here's the thing about the second coming. We just don't know. And Christ has made very clear. Okay. It's not. So it honestly, and I mean this seriously, it could happen before the end of this class, right? The end of this conversation. And so the point is, what do you want Christ to find you doing when he comes back? Every moment you should be ready, right? Sober and awake, as the readings in Advent now are telling us. On the other hand, right, it could be 30,000 years, which is, the Psalms tell us, is like a blink of an eye to God. So I guess you ought to make plans for tomorrow and the next day and the next day, right? I got to feed my kids. I got to go to the store. I got whatever. Like, yeah, that's all appropriate. But at every moment, you ought to say to yourself, what if my life is required of me right now? Right? Because it might happen. It seems to me, every day and every moment has to be lived, right, in the view of God in that way. But while still sort of saying, yeah, but I have to make plans for my children and my grandchildren and my wife and my society and my community. And, but again, that's my job. And if God decides to take me away from it, then I guess he knows best, when the work that I am supposed to do is done. That's a hard thing. Don't get me wrong.
It's
It's
a
easy
really
to
hard
say.
thing.
As I say in the book, look, this is like, it's easy to say in a way, right? Harder to do. And as I admit in the beginning of the book, well, I'm no saint or anything. I mean, it's like all the stuff that I'm talking about, all the kind of, um, odd feelings about death and difficulty facing up to it, etc. I suffer from all that. Okay. I grew up in the society. I have this thing. I said, look, the idea of death creeps me out completely, right? I'm probably the last person in the world to write a book like this. I mean, I do know people like my wife who have no trouble. They like walking through cemeteries and seeing things. I don't like it at all. I've always hated cemeteries. The only way I sort of got used to it was when I was in graduate school and I had to walk by the cemetery every day on the way to and from class. I lived just off campus. And so I had to walk by this cemetery, even in the middle of the night. So I made a deal with them, right? The spirits. I said, all right, here's the deal, guys. I will pray for you every day, every time I walk by, right? I will say Hail Marys and Our Father and the glory, and I will pray for the spirits of the dead every day. And then you don't haunt me, right? Like, we make this deal and it's all okay. And it got better. It was good, but still, look, I get all the angst and anxiety and the problems of dealing with it and thinking about hospitals and aging. Look, because I have all that. Okay, I do understand, which is why I want the church to pick up the ball on this in a different way, and communities to pick up the ball on this, and embrace people in the process of dying, instead of putting it away as some embarrassing thing, like, oh, how embarrassing, they're dying. Oh, did you hear there's disease? They're just like, yeah, that happens. It's just part of life. It's not pleasant, but there's a lot of not pleasant things that we put up with and we deal with because we know it's better. Like wind sprints, people work out, people go on diets, etc., etc. Yeah, this is hard. I admit it, but that's why you have to have that vision very clearly in your mind of the good news that the church embodies, right? Of the resurrected Christ. Otherwise, you just try to put it away. Let's not think about it, right? Or people sometimes do think about it, but not a certain kind of weird way, so they become morbid, goth chick kind of thing, like oh, I'll sit in a graveyard and pretend I'm dead or something. And the point is like, yeah, that's it's not, I'm not sure that's going to be helpful, but anyway.
I'm going to shift gears just a little bit, but this ties into the resurrection. In the book, you talk about a conversation with a friend about the Eucharist. You say, I asked whether she believed in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. And she replied, well, I believe Christ is spiritually present. Is this what the church teaches?
No, actually, and here's why this relates, right?
Yeah.
It seems to me that part of the reason that I argue for the importance of the bodily resurrection, right, and that connection, the communion of saints to us, is one of the tragedies of losing faith in the real presence of Christ, the bodily presence of Christ in the Eucharist, right, is that there's a concomitant related loss of faith in the real presence of one's deceased loved ones anymore, right? People will say in that Hollywood way, right, like, oh, where's mommy, and then there's that some like, no, she's alive. If we keep her alive right here in our hearts, as long as we remember her. And the point is like, yeah, that's cheap grace, right? I'm afraid, I think, right? It's also, I think, actually abusive in a way, because of course, if my grandmother is only staying alive to the degree that I remember her, days and days and days go by where I don't remember her. And that means what? She's dead. And the more I forget, the more I go on in my life and other things enter into my life and I'm not keeping that memory alive, then she's dead. Right. And I just don't think that's a good way of thinking about it. Right. She, I think, is more alive and present to God than I am, actually, able now to pray for me. Right. When I ask, and not just like, oh, in my imagination, I think that. No, right. That's not what people want. People don't want sort of like, well, in my imagination, I can remember my wife. But of course, then people are like, I'm forgetting what her face was. The point is, that's okay. She's still alive in the resurrection. All right. That's, I think, very important. So anyway, the problem with then not believing that Christ is bodily present in the Eucharist, or that Christ was bodily present in the upper room after the crucifixion, which is what the scriptures make very clear, okay, is that then you no longer have that thing which anchors you to believe that, in fact, you're, or what I argue about the upper room, and what I argue about the Eucharist in terms of the faith of that, is you have to believe Christ is as present there as he was to the disciples in the upper room after the crucifixion. And he was as present there, and indeed even more present than he was during his life, right? So you're actually, Thomas is actually touching the Christ, Jesus bodily, right? When he says, I wouldn't believe unless I put my finger in his side, right?
Right.
And so yeah, it's a true presence. It's not merely a subjective presence. It's not merely like, well, I have him in my imagination or my memory. No, like real, actual presence of a real person. And if you can't have that about Christ, then you're not going to have that about, your beloved grandmother or grandfather or, daughter who died in a terrible car accident or something like that, right? To believe that they are still actually really present, right? As present as they were in life, all right? And connected to you even more intimately now than they were during life. As C.S. Lewis says about after the death of his wife Joy, he still believes that there was a deep relationship there, right? And that she was still present to him in important ways and praying for him. And I think he's onto something very, very important about the communion of saints.
Randall, what else would you like to share with the regular Catholic guy listeners?
What should I say? Tune into the regular Catholic guy all the time, right? This is a great podcast, so you should, Jeff Garrett does this, his free time. He's great. I could do that. Would that help? Because it does seem to me that's true. If you like this podcast, you should tune in again. I'm sure there's other even better people than this Smith guy that he had on this one time. And Also, you should read The Catholic Thing. Okay. I publish on The Catholic Thing pretty much every other week. But not only me, there's other wonderful people who publish on The Catholic Thing. I think it's one of the best of those Catholic websites. And the thing about The Catholic Thing, if you haven't read it, is the editor, Robert Royal, is a very interesting guy in himself. But you may have seen him on EWTN, but Robert's idea about The Catholic Thing as a website is that the article should be no longer, I'm not allowed a word over 1,000 words, because his view was, and this used to rankle me when I first started writing, right? His view is, look, no more than 1,000 words. If people can't read an article in 5 minutes over breakfast in the morning, they won't read it. And I remember I was like, oh, I hate, I mean, the web, we should, there's no limitations on pages or stuff. My wife was the one who said to me, I think he's right about that. Anyway, and I've come to realize I think he is right about that. So anyway, if you want shortish, articles you can read that are great in 5 minutes, then you can read The Catholic Thing in every morning, I guess. And I guess I was told here, Jeff, you read it, right?
I get it. Yeah.
So
and I'm going
that's
to put
something.
I'm going to put it in the show notes, the link to it.
Yeah. So there you go. That's another thing. And of course, people should buy From Here to Eternity. I mean, if they're interested in that topic, I think it's, I hope, I happened to glance at Amazon yesterday. I had to make a hyperlink to something I was writing for the book. And I noticed there were 3 reviews, only one that actually said anything. And fortunately, this one person, very nice, and said very readable. I thought, well, that's the nicest thing I ever would want somebody to say about the book, is that it was very readable. So anyway, yeah, it's that's I don't know. And of course, I always say, whenever anybody writes me about Catholic Thing or book or anything else, I always try to say something I learned from the late great Father James Shaw, when he would sort of take his leave from people. He would say, in his own chipper way, he'd say, "Pray for me and I'll pray for you." Right. Anyway, so that would, I suppose, be the other thing I could say, is that people should please keep me in your prayers. I need them, especially, as I said, on this issue of death, because as I admitted, I wrote this book, but it doesn't mean I'm all at ease with any of that kind of stuff. My wife just had one of her dear friends die yesterday, in fact. And again, the notion of somebody that somebody loves died, they write and go, "Oh, did you see this person died?" It's kind of like, ooh, okay. I got to grab myself here. Jesus is here. Anyway, I got to go to mass today, right? Because now I'm freaked out or something. Anyway, and there's tremendous consolation in that. But anyway, yeah, so prayers for the poor authors of books.
Thank you, Randall.
All right. Thank you, Jeff.
God bless.
God bless.